Hello, I'm Peter Upfold. I'm one of the developers of Amalia, an open source content management system from Van Patten Media. Amalia is website management for the rest of us. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate a basic installation of Amalia. I'll be using a fairly standard Apache installation on Ubuntu 11.10, but this process should be similar on other configurations. Before we get started on the install, let's take a moment to review some of the basics of Amalia so we know what we're doing. There are a few requirements that your web server will need for Amalia to work. Let's have a look. First of all, PHP needs to be version 5.2.3 or later. You're going to need the curl, GD with JPEG, PNG and GIF support, extensions, and you're also going to want MIME content type support in PHP. So you may just need to check those extensions, and at the time of recording this you'll probably have MIME content type anyway. That should be fine. There are also a few PHP options that will require for Amalia. Both Magic Quotes GPC and Magic Quotes Runtime need to be disabled. And you might also want to set max post size and max upload size to whatever you want in php.ini so that your users can upload files of a size you choose. And finally, Amalia at the moment does expect a Unix-based operating system to run under, such as Linux or Mac OS X. It might run under Windows, and there might be some progress we can make towards compatibility with Windows, but that's not currently supported. It's also recommended that you use an Apache server for the purpose of pretty URLs, which we may come on to a bit later on. So if your server has all of those requirements met, we can go ahead and get started. So before we jump in and install, let's take a moment to review a few key points about Amalia. Now, Amalia's installer will want us to provide the path to 3 different folders. So let's look at these in turn. First of all, the site path. The site path is the path to the public website. It's the base path that the web server is going to serve your website from. In my example, we're going to use /var/www/vhosts/example. The config path is the path to the Amalia interface on the server. Now usually this is going to be the same as the site path with /Amalia appended to it, so that the user can go to the public website, and if they want to make any changes they can just go to example.com/Amalia. So in my example this is going to be /var/www/vhosts/example/Amalia, which is just the site path and then /Amalia. Finally, the user's path, and this is quite important. This is the path to the users and permissions files, and we keep it separate from the site path and config path for security reasons. It's very, very important that this folder is outside of the document root, and that's the place where the server serves the website from, so that we can't ever get into a situation where the users and the permissions levels are accessible to people who are on the web. In my example, we're going to use /var/Amalia_users, and that's a folder I've created for that purpose. Again, it's very important to note that this is outside anywhere that the web server can serve up, so it's not inside www in this particular example. So once you've worked out where your site path, config path and users path are going to be, and created them, you need to be aware of the file permissions. Now Amalia doesn't use a MySQL database. In fact, it doesn't use a database at all. It's all plain text files. This means that the user account under which the web server runs has got to be able to write to the site path, config path, and the user's path. I'll show setting up these permissions a bit later on. We should avoid using permissions mode 777, which basically removes all of the security. Instead, we're going to work out the web server user, and then we're going to use chown to change the ownership of the files so that the web server can write to them. On the example Ubuntu server, the web server user is www-data, so that's the user we're going to make own the files. But again, we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we get into the install. Right, now that we have the basics, we know what we're doing, we know about the site path, the config path, and the user's path, and we know that we're going to have to change the file permissions. Let's just quickly run through what we're going to be doing in this install. First of all, we're going to create the 3 paths, if they're not created already. Then we'll upload the Amalia files to the config path. Then we're going to set the permissions on all 3 paths so that the web server user can write to them and so Amalia can do its work. And finally, we're going to go to the web and run the installer, which will guide us through the final part of the installation. So, without any further ado, let's get started with the demo. So what I've done is I've opened up my file transfer program and I've logged into the server, and here we are in the site path, var www vhosts example. You'll notice at this point that the config path doesn't yet exist. I haven't made that. So let's create that now. I'll just make a new folder and call it Amalia. And that's where we're going to be putting the files here, which are the Amalia files, in just a moment. Before we do that, let's go back up to var and just look to check that Amalia_users exists. And this is the users path. So again, we have our 3 folders. The users path here, the site path here, and the config path here. Now, the next step was we upload the Amalia files into the config path. So let's do that. I'll just bring them right across. And there we go. We've finished uploading the files. Now, if you remember, we're next going to do the permissions. So we need to make sure that the web server user can write to all 3 of these folders. I'm just going to switch over to terminal to do the permissions change. But you might be able to do this in your file transfer program if you prefer, and if your program supports that. So what I'm going to do is just change the ownership of all of these 3 paths. I'm in /var right now. And I just need to do, here on Ubuntu, sudo chown -r www data Amalia_users. The users path can now be written to by the web server. Let's do the same for the whole of the config path. Sorry, the whole of the site path. And because the config path is underneath the site path, we can do one command to get both. So we'll go into www and then go into vhosts and then do a very similar thing, sudo chown -r www data example. And as I say, that's going to change the permissions for both the site path and the config path, because the config path is underneath the site path and we said -r. And again, if you've got a better way of changing permissions using your file transfer protocol, you're more than welcome to use that. Alright, so that's done. We've changed the permissions. Now we just need to run the installer. So I'll go across here, and the site is actually example.getamalia.com. There's nothing in the site path yet, so I'm getting this permissions problem, but that's fine. We just need to go to /Amalia, which is our config path, which will start the installer. And here we go, we just have to walk through the installer now. I'll go to the next page and it will check the server requirements to make sure everything is exactly as it should be. And as you see, this server passed, so I can continue. Now we'll be asked for the config path. Now it's guessed it here, and that looks about right. It's also guessed the config URL, which is example.getamalia.com/Amalia, and that's just the URL which corresponds to the config path. Again, that's guessed that right, so we can leave it. And how do I know that? Because I can look up here and see this is the config URL. We now ask for the site path. The site URL, which again is just the URL version of the site path. In this case, it's just example.getamalia.com. And finally, the users path, which is var Amalia_users. Once we've entered all of those paths, we can just go to the next page, and we're setting up our first account to log in to Amalia, so I'll set that up here. And next, and that's it, the install's done. So now we can just go across to the config path, which is, the config URL. We can go across to the config URL, example.getamalia.com/Amalia, and log in. So here we are, we're inside the Amalia system. I can just give myself a name here. Now you'll notice up here the security notice. What we're going to want to do is delete the installer folder so that nobody else can run another Amalia install. So we'll just click on here and that issue is resolved. And that's it, we now have Amalia. So what I'm going to do very, very quickly is just create a basic homepage. We'll call this homepage. And here, if you have some other templates installed, you can choose them from here. And now I just enter some text. And again, you can choose a template if you have more than one installed. So now I just click Save, return to the file browser, and you can see I've got my first file. If I now go back to the root of the website, there we are, and there's no pretty theme installed yet, but as you can see, this is a completely editable website now with Amalia. And there we go, we've set up Amalia from scratch using the installer. If you have any feedback on Amalia, do let us know. You can go to getamalia.com and find all of the contact information there. I'm Peter Upfold. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Goodbye.